بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. الحمد لله. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we have reached the section on the other ways of removing filth. Right? So there are the normal way of removing, the typical way of removing filth is through the use of water. And akin to using water is to use any other liquid, right? And we discussed that. But there are a number of other ways of removing filth. The general principle is that كل ما تزول به النجاسة فهو مطهر. Anything that removes filth is a means of purification. These are just some of the ways of removal of filth that are established in prophetic teachings. Right? As a whole, they establish the principle that المعتبر في فيما يتعلق بالنجاسة إزالتها بأي وجه كان. Right? That what counts when it comes to filth is its removal, however that removal may be. Right? However that removal may be. So we stopped at ويطهر الخف ونحوه, correct? So he says رحمه الله تعالى ويطهر الخف ونحوه كالنعل بالماء وبالمائع, the khuf and the like of it, كالنعل, such as the khuf, the leather sock, or the like of it, such as a sandal is purified with water and with any liquid, وبالدلك, and also by rubbing. Right? So and what is by rubbing? بالأرض أو بالتراب. Right? On the ground or with soil. من نجاسة لها جرم, from any filth that has a body. ولو مكتسبا, even if the body is acquired. Even if the body is acquired. من غيرها, from other than itself. على الصحيح كتراب أو رماد وضع على الخف قبل جفافه, such as soil or dust that is put on the khuf before it dries, من نجاسة مائعة, from liquid filth. So what happens? Someone stepped with their khuf on urine. Now they can't wash their khuf, they want to rub it, so what do? They stepped on urine. So then you step on some sand or soil, so the najasa gets a jirm, a body that is acquired, which is the sand or soil, and then you can just rub it on the ground till no trace of the filth remains. Khalas, that's sufficient. Why? Because it may be too cold, for example, to wash away the filth, etc. Right? So the right? يطهر خف ونحوه, and the khuf is made pure or the like of it. Imam Tahtawi adds a useful point, which is بشرط ذهاب الأثر إلا أن يشق, on condition that the traces disappear except what is difficult. إلا ما يشق يعني بالدلك, right? With the dalk. Right? So let's say there's some really nasty najasa, so you rubbed it, the actual trace is not there, but there's still a bad smell. Right? With a regular rubbing, it's gone. Right? Now the tricky thing is with This applies to flat-soled shoes for sure. So dalk is enough. The problem with shoes that have soles is that no najasa should visibly be on the soles. But you can do dalk, you can rub till no najasa remains on the grooves of the soles. Simple. But be more cautious to wash it if there's grooves. But you can rub it till الشرط is ذهاب الأثر. Right? So if you rub it enough on the ground, even in grooves, right? It's enough. Okay. ولو كانت المتجسدة من أصلها أو باكتساب الجرم من غيرها رطبة. Even if the solid najasa that's originally solid, like excrement, or that acquired a body by stepping on sand or soil or dust, was moist. على المختار للفتوى, on the position chosen for fatwa. Right? 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 There's some discussion on what's meant by a najasa that has a body. Tahtawi mentions it, you can see it there. Right? And when they mention al al-Mukhtari lil fatwa, this is pointing to the fact that there is difference of opinion. Right? There is difference of opinion, and it's a subject matter of caution. وعليه أكثر المشايخ. Most of the ulama said this. Right? ولقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم, and because of the words of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, إذا جاء أحدكم المسجد فلينظر. If one of you goes to the masjid, then look. فإن رأى في نعليه أذى أو أذى أو قذرا فليمسحهما. If they see any filth, right, or dirt on their feet, then rub it. وَلْيُصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمَا, or لِيُصَلِّ فِيهِمَا, and then pray with them. And of course, there's a treatise by Imam al-Kawthari, because literalists appeared early in the 20th century, and others too. There's a treatise by Shaykh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi on this issue of the ruling of praying in sandals. And the simple reasoning is, the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ was sandal friendly, because the masjid did not have carpeting, it had soil. And the nature of soil is that it gets covered over and stuff, right? But it would be impermissible, without any doubt, to enter the masjid that has carpeting with shoes that are dirty. Particularly if that what is allowed in a masjid, the masjid is a waqf. والمعتبر في الوقف شرط الواقف والعرف. And what counts in the waqf is the condition made by the one who made the waqf and the urf. In any masjid, would they be fine if you walked in with your shoes to the sisters area? No. So it would not be permitted, because any waqf is limited by the conditions of the waqf, except there's some conditions that they excluded, because they're just condition made foolishly. Someone made a waqf that this masjid is built for the Afghani people, nobody else is welcome. They say, we accept that, هذا شرط لغو. So that's a bit of patriotism, right? We'll put an Afghani flag inside somewhere, says everybody welcome, right? Masajid are for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the shurut al-mu'tabara, someone wants it to always be painted, whatever, so that comes in masajid. But shurut, when it's made, some conditions are made, those are observed. So, قيد بالخف احترازا عن الثوب والبساط واحترازا عن البدن إلا في المني لما تقدم. So in the matan, the condition is made, the qaid of the khuf. That what can you rub najasa clean from? It's the khuf. The khuf, and like the khuf, is the sandal or the shoe. Right? وَنَحْوُهُ كَالنَّعْلِ. And like the shoe, so the sandal is simple, because the na'al is flat. A shoe that has a sole, some scholars are very strict on it. That no, the point is that you rub until the athar goes. So depends on the nature of the sole, right? Like some industrial boots have really complicated soles and very deep soles. So it's that, if it's such that were you to rub, the athar al-najasa disappears, then you can rub it. If the sole is such that it doesn't, rubbing is not enough, then you need to wash or do whatever else. Right? And the hadith related in Sunan Abi Dawood. Of course, in the Sunan of Abu Dawood are particularly important for students of fiqh, because Imam Abu Dawood focused on putting hadiths that have ahkam in them. Right? So it's particularly important for a hadith of ahkam. وَيَطْهُرُ السَّيْفُ وَنَحْوُهُ. And a sword or the like of it is purified, he says, bil-masih, by wiping. Right? And what is like the sword, and the basis of this is that the Sahaba fought battles. They used swords and they just wiped them and they put them back on there, and then they hung the sword and they prayed with them. So it indicates, and also so that's in terms of the athar, that we know that the Sahaba prayed with their swords after battle. There's no necessity, you could just take it off and put it next to you. That's in terms of transmission. In terms of al-ma'qul, is that we see from all the different texts related to najasa that what counts with najasa is just izala, it's just to get rid of it. If it's not there, it's gone. How it went, it's not up to us. Right? What's like the safe, what's like the sword, كالمرآة والأواني المدهونة, such as a mirror or polished containers. Containers with madhuna literally means polished, but means those that have a من كل ثقيل لا مسام له, from every smooth surface that does not have deep indentations. والخشب الخرائط والأبنوس, right? And hardwoods, right? Hardwoods that لا يتشرب النجاسة, they don't soak in the filth, right? And that have a smooth surface. والظفر, or your nail, or the nail, or even the surface of the washroom. Right? Small grooves don't harm. Small grooves are not a problem. Right? Small grooves are not a problem. Right? If you rub, if the najasa goes away, khalas, that groove doesn't hurt. But deep grooves that najasa stays in, then obviously the wiping itself is not enough. بالمسح, with rubbing, بالتراب أو خرقة, whether it be with soil or with a cloth or with anything, لأنها لا تتداخلها أجزاء النجاسة, because these things, smooth surfaces, the najasa is not absorbed by them. أو صوف الشاة المذبوحة, or by the wool of a slaughtered sheep. But it's pure, you could use it like felt, for example, right? فلا يبقى, so the najasa does not remain بعد المسح, after wiping, إلا القليل, except a little bit. وهو غير معتبر, and that little bit is of no consequence. It's كالمعدوم. And then there's a difference of opinion. This مسألة is كل this مسألة of المحكوم عليه بالطهارة من غير ماء, something that we deem to be pure without the use of water. That is it just taqleel of najasa, or is there dhahabun najasa? Is the najasa considered to have been removed if we didn't use water? Right? Is it simply taqleel? And the issue arises that if it's taqleel, then if water falls on it again, is it najis or not? Right? So he says, وَيَحْصُلُ بِالْمَسْحِ حَقِيقَةُ التَّطْهِيرِ فِي رِوَايَةٍ. And by wiping, we get actual tahara in one narration. This has consideration. Someone went and slaughtered someone in battle, wiped their sword, and says, part of the war spoils was a watermelon. So they cut the watermelon. Does the watermelon become najis? No. Or they slaughtered a cow, and then they wiped the sword, and then they cut the watermelon. Is it the watermelon najis or not? Right? So on one narration, فإذا قطع بها البطيخ يحل أكله. It's permitted to eat. واختاره الإسبيجابي. One of the great early imams had a sharh on quduri and other things. Right? ويحرم على رواية التقليل. And the other narration, that wiping and the other things, wiping, scraping the mani, etc. كل ما حكم عليه بالطهارة من بغير الماء. It simply reduces the filth. Therefore, afterwards, does it become najis or not? And the riwayah of taqleel, اختاره القدوري. Quduri chose that one. So here, Imam Shurumbulali doesn't really say anything explicit in the commentary. What's indicated by the matan is al-hukm bil-tahara. And Imam al-Tahtawi, when he says قوله الإسبيجابي, he says هو الأولى بالاعتبار, that in terms of hukum, this opinion that it becomes pure is superior to consider. Why? لإطلاق المتون, because that's what's understood from what's mentioned without condition in the mutun. But then he says ولا يخفى الاحتياط, but caution is evident. Right? ولا فرق بين الرطب والجاف والبول والعذرة على المختار للفتوى. And there's no difference in being able to rub the filth from a smooth surface, whether the filth is moist or dry, and whether it's urine or excrements, for the opinion that's chosen for fatwa. Because again, right? The other opinion, and Imam Tahtawi quotes it from the sharh of Sayyid Abu Saud, right? Is that if the filth has dried, then you need to wet the cloth. And that's caution. Because the filth is dried, just wiping it, especially like something like excrement, it sort of takes hold. So use a wetted thing. This is just in terms of caution. Right? And you can see that in Tahtawi. And the number of times Tahtawi quotes a Sayyid should make tashweeq of anyone with slight himma in like checking out a Sayyid and his sharh. It's a beautiful makhtut. It sort of tempts you to read it. Don't get distracted, but it just doesn't hurt to have it. Rabbani can share the link to the makhtut. You don't have to upload the makhtut there, but just share a link to it. لأن الصحابة رضي الله تعالى عنهم كانوا يقتلون الكفار بسيوفهم ثم يمسحونها ويصلون معها, because the Sahaba used to be in battle, killing their disbelieving enemies with their swords, and then they would wipe them and pray with the swords, even when, and there's many situations where there wasn't evident fear, so it's not out of necessity, right? And then he says وإذا ذهب أثر النجاسة عن الأرض وجفت وقد جفت, and if the trace of the filth disappears from the ground and it dries, right? And it dries ولو بغير الشمس على الصحيح طهرت, even if without any sunlight, because some said the reason is the sun burns away the najasa. That's not the reason. The ibrah is we only deem something najis is because the najasa is there. If we can't see it, we deem it gone. وَجَازَتِ الصَّلَاةُ عَلَيْهَا, and prayer is valid upon it. لقول قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم أيما أرض جفت فقد ذكت or قد ذكت. Any ground that becomes dry has become purified. دون التيمم منها, but you cannot perform tayammum on that specific place where the filth had fallen, and we just deem it to be pure through drying. Fil adhar, and this is the stronger of two opinions. One opinion even allows tayammum from it. لاشتراط الطيب نصا, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. So make tayammum with, and the sa'id refers to anything pure from the surface of the earth. So اشتراط الطيب is a wasf zaid, is an extra quality. Right? وَرُوِيَ جَوَازُهُ مِنْهَا, and there's a narration that you can even make tayammum upon it. So someone urinated in this particular spot, and then the trace of the filth disappeared. You don't have to come up with a proof why is it not there. Right? It's tahir. You could pray on that spot. You could even make tayammum from that spot. But according to one narration, the relied upon position is you can't make tayammum from there because the condition is tayammamu sa'idan, which is anything pure from the surface of the earth, but it's extra condition of tayyiban. ويطهر ما بها أي الأرض من شجر وكلى أي عشب قائم أي نابت فيها بجفافه, and everything that's upon the soil of growth and grass that's standing, that also becomes pure by its being purified from the min al-najasa. Then what does it say? Right? بجفافه, right? And here it has to be dry. Right? لا يبسه عن رطوبته. It's not sufficient that it simply cease to be moist. It has to have become dry. Because in other places earlier, if you're paying attention, it's sufficient, like when you squeeze the cloth, there it's sufficient that it no longer be dripping wet. Here it needs to actually dry. There, you squeeze the cloth until حتى ينقطع التقاطر, right? Until it's no longer dripping wet, but it's still going to be moist. Right? Unless you're really strong, you can't squeeze the water from the cloth such that it's completely dry. It'll still be moist. But here the ground, it's not that it's no longer dripping wet, the ground has to have actually dried out. Right? وذهاب أثرها تبعا للأرض على المختار. And if the trace of filth goes from the tree or the plants, because it's تابع للأرض, and the principle is التابع لا يفرد بالحكم. Details are not singularized in rulings. وقيل لا بد من غسله. And the minority opinion, you have to wash the tree or something. An animal urinated on the ground and the tree, if it dries, that's sufficient. Right? And again, if water affects it, it's tahir. Right? And what's considered ground is everything that's considered ground. Right? Imam Tahtawi explains that. Right? So that includes stone, pebbles, jur, even like any flooring that we have, including bricks and so on, right? If it's connected to the ground, right? Right? And like the ground is walls, right? Walls and doors, etc. Right? 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 And there's some discussion on that. But so, like the ground is so they say كل ما كان متصلا بالأرض اتصال قرار. Anything that is permanently connected to the ground. So the fuqaha gave fatwa, and this is a lot of ease in it. Because it's better not to practice, especially for something like the masjid. But if you have wall-to-wall carpeting on the ground, you're going on, you're running late for your flight. Last thing one of the kids did, they opened the door to the house and vomited in, and they decided to urinate inside. Right? Zubair's son did that, not our children. They wouldn't do that, but Zubair got stressed. He said, "We gotta go." So he locked the door. But the entrance, Ibn Zubair had, or the son of Zubair, right, had urinated on the ground. They come back. Zubair didn't want to tell Zubair that because they're already having stressful relationship. They come back. Zubair sees there's no trace of that urine on the ground. There are two opinions about things like carpeting, but they said the same ruling applies. If it's connected to the ground, like wall-to-wall carpeting, it takes the ruling of the ground. But there's a cautious opinion that it's not considered ground. If the traces go, like we don't have to prove. Like, how did it go? Like najasa is not a hukum ta'abbudi. Who knows? Like we don't have to prove why it's gone. Of course, caution is to wash it, but it takes that ruling. But of course, especially in a masjid or a musalla or your place of prayer, because you're coming in and out, but it's in a remote corner of the house, etc. You can take this opinion, right? And you can see it's mentioned in the Dur al-Mukhtar, etc. about it. Okay, and then we'll look at the issue of istihala. We'll pause here for Maghrib and then we'll continue. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So, this is if the ground becomes dry. And the fatwa position is, and this mentioned in the Durr al-Mukhtar by Imam al-Haskafi and confirmed by Ibn Abdin, that in these things the fatwa position is that each of these things, ما حكم عليه بزوال النجاسة بالطهارة, that what happens, that if water falls on it, لا يرجع حكم النجاسة. And the قاعدة is لأن الساقط لا يعود. This is لأن الساقط لا يعود. Right? Because سقط حكم النجاسة. The ruling of najasa is lifted. So if it's lifted, there's only two states, right? Najasa or tahara. So if we say this tahir, then water falls on tahir, how can it become najis? And also because mabna amr tahara ala tawassu', right? 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 على التوسع, right? That the basis of tahara is the rulings of tahara are expansive. But what's the ruling of caution? Yeah, caution is al-ihtiyat mustahab, right? So in these things someone wants to be cautious, but of course then, but caution has its places. There's a difference. It's your living room that this happens. There's a big difference between your living room and the backyard. Right? Because the backyard, especially in a place like Canada, it rains, so many things happen. But it doesn't rain in your living room. I hope it doesn't, right? Right? So there's a difference, right? You don't typically pray, like if you have some, like you have some, like a cemented part or whatever in your backyard, and then the garden, that part, how often do you pray there? Hardly. And if you did, you typically put something on top of it. So that's different from, so caution applies where appropriate. Right? Alhamdulillah. وتطهر نجاسة استحالت عينها كأن صارت ملحا أو ترابا أو أطرونا أو احترقت بالنار. Right? So najasa becomes pure if it is essentially transformed. Istahalat. Right? Istahalat aynuha. If its essence is transformed, such as it becoming salt or dust, or what's utrunan? What's utrunan? Anyone look it up? What? What? What's that? Yeah. Yeah. So, if it becomes wet mud, like, this is, for example, if it, let's say there's a well, and they had a small well, so it's a ma' qalil. They left their kid in detention outside. So Afghani uncle decided to be tough on his son, so he put him in detention outside. But the son's also Afghani. The son of an Afghani is Afghani. He said, yeah, you're going to give me a hard time? So I need to use the washroom. He said, tough. Okay. So he defecated in the well. But uncle's a faqih. He drained the water, washed the plants in the back. Now what happens? there's a little bit of water there, it just becomes mud. No trace of the najasa remains. That, because it's changed. So the issue is, right, that now there's a number of people who've written about this. Shaykh Ashraf Munib has written a treatise on this issue. I don't think it's published, but we could ask somebody. Could you email him? Ask if that he could share the results of his research on this, on the issue of istihala. Could you task him to do it? Okay. CC me in it. It's quite useful. He did good. I've discussed the research with him. And the basic issue is that the fuqaha described istihala descriptively. We've talked a little bit about this. Right? Or it's burnt with fire. فَتَصِيرُ رَمَادًا طَاهِرًا. So you have, for example, you burnt the najasa till all that remains is dust. على الصحيح لتبدل الحقيقة, because its reality has changed. كالعصير يصير خمرا, such as juice, grape juice becomes wine. ثم يصير خلا, and then the wine becomes vinegar. فيطهر فينجس, when the grape juice is pure, it becomes wine, it becomes najis. Then the wine becomes vinegar, it becomes pure. فيطهر. Right? So here, this indicates that its haqiqah, its essence changes. But some describe that the reality of something changes by the changing of its attributes. And then there's this issue, the ulama differed in how you interpret it. They say, وَبُخَارُ الْكَنِيفِ. What's the kanif? Of the public toilet. So the public toilet, let's say on a cold day, Zubair's hiding from Zubaydah. So there's these public toilets with an open roof, right, in the village. So they moved to a village. So he's sitting at the roof of the public toilet. Cold day, all these people urinate, the bukhar from that comes out from the vent. He was sitting by the vent and he's riddled with the bukhar of their urination. Bukharul kanif. Walistabl, or someone's sitting on top of the stable and there's this bukhar coming from there, which is from the najasa. There's a camel in the stable. I don't know how much camels urinate, but let's say the bunch of animals urinate a lot, lots of steam came out. You got the steam on you. Wal-hammam, right? Or of the public bath. إذا قطر لا يكون نجسا. If the bukhar gets on somebody and it's dripping, it's not najis. Istihsanan, because of legal preference. The qiyas would be that it is filthy. Because this is, so here one interpretation of this fara is that this istihsan, this legal preference, الاستحسان هو عدول عن قياس جليل لقياس خفي لعارض. Istihsan is to leave an obvious line of reasoning for a less obvious line of reasoning due to secondary considerations. So one is that this is من باب المعفو عنه لا من باب الاستحالة. That this is just excused. We don't even know what is it steam from. And sorry, because it's just the context. Najasa strikes the wall, steam comes up. Are we sure it's the najasa that steamed or water that was on the wall that steamed? We don't know. We don't need to prove it. Right? Number two, because in those contexts it would be difficult to avoid. Someone's working the stables in winter and there's a lot of najasa steam because the horses come in, they all urinate. And you bring the horses in, you keep getting the steam on you, then you got to pray. Right? So it's min bab al-ma'fu anhu. That's one argument. And Shaykh Adib inclined towards this. Others said no, that if something changes in its characteristics and the awsaf of the najasa are not manifest, when the urine becomes steam, we don't see any traces of the najasa. But then they say, what if, and this is theoretically, so there's urine, it was liquid. What if someone boiled the urine so it becomes steam and then they gathered it? There's khilaf on it. We don't need to look in that. Of course, because it could be distilled. It could be distilled. It just, you did it such that you boiled away the water. So if it, and al-ibra bi dhuhur al-athar. So some said, what counts in the States? A liquid becomes steam and then becomes liquid again. In this process, are the qualities of the najasa, color, smell, taste, still manifest? It's najis. If it's not, it's no longer najis. So this would indicate that what counts is the changing of the qualities. Does it resemble the najasa or not? And one of the arguments that at what level do you have to look at essential transformation? Some people say chemical transformation. Did the Salaf really look at, did they do a chemical analysis of, because it happened during the time of the Salaf, that a donkey fell into some salt and years later it disintegrated completely. So what happens? Did they do a chemical analysis of it? No. It's that, are the awsaf still there? So this leads to difference on things like gelatin. Ta-da, right? Is it najis or not? Like gelatin from unslaughtered sources. And there's ikhtilaf. Interestingly, there's ikhtilaf amongst both Orthodox and conservative Jews about gelatin. Same thing, same khilaf that exists amongst the fuqaha. Of course, so caution is obvious. Caution is obvious. But the line of reasoning that if the essential qualities of something change, then it's changed, right? And one of the examples they use is the zaytun mutanajjis sara sabunan. Oil that had najasa, it becomes a soap. And now none of the qualities of the najasa are there. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. What's the ruling? That the saboon is a different substance from the zayt. And it's a zahir, it's taghayyurul awsaf. So in there is leeway. There's leeway. So things like soap and lotions and so on, there's leeway. One of the practical things that Mufti Mahmoud Ashraf Usmani also mentioned is also just in terms of ingredients as a guiding principle. Of course, don't give yourself a fatwa. You don't know if something's allowed or not. Check what the ulama say. But there is a lot of overstatement on this. This still needs a lot of work. I haven't seen good, like something I'd be personally comfortable with. I haven't seen such research on it. There's somebody whose name I mentioned before. He's done good work on it in Urdu. I don't know if it's available in English. You guys need to check. His name is Mufti. Okay. His name is like mine. Yeah. If it's available in English, but it's good, but it's very conservative on these, which is good. That's taqwa. But especially because a lot of people are in difficult situations, there is khilaf. On gelatin, there is khilaf. Don't act upon it yourself, but you don't have to correct someone who does it. There's genuine difference of opinion. I know some God-fearing ulama, when they researched it, they came to the conclusion that there's essential transformation. So when it comes, things that are secondary ingredients, you have to also keep in mind that we already took alcohol. Khamr itself is najis. Non-wine alcohol, its consumption is not allowed as an intoxicant, but it's not najis according to Abu Hanifa. So the presence of alcohol as an ingredient like non-wine alcohol, right? So for example, like lotions and sprays and these things have alcohol. Alcohol does not make something najis. That's one. Number two, right? And that's one of the problematic ingredients, right? Number two is something that al-qalil ma'fu anhu. A little bit of something is excused. Is excused. And it's called istihlak, right? That a little bit of something such that there's no noticeable effect on the whole, this would be excused. So basically, and there's also the principle that التابع لا يفرد بالحكم, right? That if you look at something, what are the main ingredients? Is the main ingredient something clearly haram? It's not allowed. But if there's a secondary ingredient, it's a minor ingredient, so it's a small amount, such that its traces are not found, there's leeway in it. But of course, caution is to avoid fully, right? So something has coloring from a beetle, for example. How much coloring is there, right? Etc. So some of these things, but it needs, to the extent that the way to have caution is not to live on the edge, right? The way to have caution is to stay away from the edge. That's the simple way, right? And you want to be cautious, then don't buy all the synthetic junk, right? Because then you're just torturing yourself, right? You want to be cautious, then you want to have taqwa, then what did the Prophet say? كَالرَّاعِ يَرْعَى حَوْلَ الْحِمَى, like the one who grazes around the sanctuary. يُوشَكُ أَنْ يَرْتَعَ فِيهِ. It's feared that they would graze within, right? And the hima, of course, is what? Is not the limits of the land. So the king, they would have their own land would be walled, but they would say, nobody come around the hima, which is a land surrounding their land that don't come close to our limit. Right? It's not that grazing, because grazing in the king's land, people depend on the king, they would execute someone for that. It's my land, what are you doing there? قطع الرؤوس, right? But the hima is the land around it, right? Although hima is used in a number of itlaqat as well, right? Sometimes some kings would wall around their own, so that they'd have their fortress, but then they'd also they'd wall around the area, because these are under my protection. So they put some limits. So they're not the king's land, they may belong to the farmer, but these are my land. You cannot come here without permission from me. They may have sentries, so there's different uses. Anyways, point being that this is an issue where we have to look for fatwa on specific things. وَالْمُسْتَقْتِرْ مِنَ النَّجَاسَةِ نَجِسٌ. But that which drips from filth is filthy, right? كالمسمى بالعرق حرام. What's al-araqi? No. كالمسمى بالعرق. What's al-araqi? What is it? Right. So it's what's al-araqi? Right. It's that which it drips from the production of wine, in the making of the wine. That is also considered najis. Right? And here, al-Isqati has a hashia on Mulla Miskin, by the way. And al-Isqati is a mu'tabar faqih. So Mulla Miskin has a sharh on Kanz al-Daqaiq. Al-Isqati has a hashia on it. I don't know if it's hanging around. وبيض ما لا يؤكل وقيل نجس كلحمه وقيل طاهر. The eggs of non-edible animals, there's difference of opinion about. The asl is najasa for them, an opinion that they're tahir. But there's two things. There's no necessary relationship between حل الشيء وجواز أكله. Something طهارة الشيء وجواز أكله. You can't eat sand except إلا تبعا, except incidentally. Can you eat worms? Can you eat worms? When could you eat worms? In eating an apple, right? The worm entered an apple. Each bite is permitted to take. Because you know the apple is tahir, there's shak that you might end up eating the worm. Right? At no point, the best thing would be to leave a little bit, even the core. But you know that hopefully it's in the core, so you didn't eat it. But every single bite is permitted ala wajh shak. Others said it's a bit like the removal of najasa. You avoid where you think the worm would be. But even if you eat the whole thing, it's allowed. Okay. ويطهر المني الجاف ولو مني امرأة على الصحيح, and semen or ejaculate is made pure, meaning the place affected by these things is purified, right? Right? يطهر المني أي محل المني, right? Right? Even if it's mixed with madhi, according to the relied upon position. Someone had pre-ejaculate and then ejaculate, that too is purified. But pre-ejaculate on its own cannot be purified by scraping. By scraping, فرك, from both clothing, ولو جديدا مبطنا, even if it's new clothing and it has two sides, right? So it's thick. وعن البدن, and likewise from one's clothing. بفركه, by rubbing it. في ظاهر الرواية, right? ولو لم إن لم يتنجس بملطخ خارج المخرج كبول. If the mani did not become najis with filth that is outside the point of exit, such as urine. Right? So this is someone urinated and they left urine on themselves and then they ejaculated later. That you could not clean that ejaculate because they had najasa on the outside, right? That's why the case of using water anyways, right? Right? So there's two things. Is that if someone urinated and didn't make istinja, and then they ejaculated, then from body or a clothes, because then the outside their body is najis. But so you can't just scrape it because the residual filth. If you made istinja with something dry, like just with tissue paper without using water, al-Zahir is the same ruling. Because the difference between istinja bil hajar and izalat al-najasa. Because if you make istinja with hajar, then you sit in a pool of water, what happens? it becomes najis. But if you scrape the mani off your body and you sit in water, what happens? It's tahir. Right? So whenever you can, just use water, right? For وَيَطْهُرُ الْمَنِي الرَّطْبِ بِغَسْلِهِ. But if the mani is still moist, then one washes it. Right? لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم اغسليه وافركيه يابسا اغسليه رطبا وافركيه يابسا. Wash it if it's moist and scrape it if it's dry. Right? This specific text is not, is problematic. Right? It's problematic. Right? Right? And Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam mentions that وَإِلَّا فَالْمُدَّعَى ثَابِتْ بِمَعْنَهُ. But what's mentioned in the hadith is established in more authentic hadith. فَقَدْ وَرَدَ فِي الصَّحِيحَيْن. Al-Tahtawi mentions that it's been related in the Sahihain عن عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنه أنها كانت تغسل المنية من ثوب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. That she used to wash the mani from the garments of the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم. And in the riwayah from Muslim, in another way, وَلَقَدْ رَأَيْتُنِي وَإِنِّي لَأَحُكُّهُ مِنْ ثَوْبِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم. And I remember seeing myself, I recall. لَقَدْ رَأَيْتُني, I saw myself. I myself did it. You don't translate it, I saw myself. رَأَيْتُني, I recall myself scraping it from the clothing of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when it was dry with my nail. Okay? And there's a number of other related hadiths, right? So then he says, فَإِنْ أَصَابَهُ الْمَاءُ بَعْدَ الْفَرْقِ. So these things, there's the same principle. If you scraped it off and no evident amount remained, فَهُوَ وَنَظَائِرُهُ كَالْأَرْضِ. It and the like of it are مِنْ كُلِّ مَا حُكِمَ عَلَيْهِ بِالطَّهَارَةِ بِغَيْرِ الْمَاءِ. Of all the things that we deem tahir without water, right? And and Tahtawi mentions that, right? Alhamdulillah, quoting the Dur. Alhamdulillah, right? كالأرض إذا جفت. They are like the ground if it becomes dry. Meaning that if it gets wet again, we said it's tahir, so it's now يعني لا يعود حكم النجاسة بعد إصابة الماء. وجلد الميتة المشمس والبئر إذا غارت. And the same thing applies to the jild of the mayta, the skin of an unslaughtered animal, or that has been put out in the sun. يعني بحيث ذهب أثر النجاسة, such that any trace of the filth, the blood, etc. disappeared. والبئر إذا غارت. And the same thing, أنه يحكم بطهارته. What's إذا غارت البئر? أي البئر المتنجسة. What's غارت? Sorry? Sorry? What do you mean? What? Yeah, it dried out. So let's say that the kid wanted to defecate in the well, but they couldn't. But they urinated in the well. So the water disappeared. There's no more water in the well, and then more water swells up. When the water disappears from the well, إذا غارت, then if it comes back, we say that the well is pure. Unless we can see the traces of the najasa. And we don't go into secondary possibilities. The water got najis, therefore the walls got najis. If you recall, مسائل المياه مبنية على الآثار. The issues related to water are based on transmission لا القياس. Because القياس أن لا تطهر أبدا. Because the legal analogy is that they never become طاهر. We took that in باب المياه. وقد اختلف التصحيح. الأولى اعتبار الطهارة في الكل كما تفيده المتون. And in all of these there's different opinion تصحيح. كل ما حكم عليه بالطهارة بغير الماء. But the superior thing is, says Imam al-Shurunbulali rahimahullah, to deem it pure, and that's what's understood from the mutun of the madhab, and the mutun were by default placed to transmit the madhab. وَمُلَاقَاتُ الطَّاهِرِ طَاهِرًا مِثْلُهُ لَا تُوجِبُ التَّنْجِيسِ. And something pure, coming into contact with something pure, like it, does not result in anything becoming najis. Right? That's the leeway position. And then he says, يَطْهُرُ جِلْدُ الْمَيْتَةِ. We'll stop there, بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. Since we're coming towards the end of Bab al-Tahara, please, please review Kitab al-Tahara. One of the ways, if you want to do a comprehensive review, there is a copy, and this is sort of a review of Nur al-Idah as well, and you guys, you guys should come up with questions collectively. Take 2 steps, right? Break down the chapters we've covered so far and come up with questions from the matan questions and sharh questions, right? And things that I've mentioned as notes, right? So come up with questions, right? First thing is, because if you realize, so come up with questions. If you come up with a method, I can approve it. But simple thing is, what's mentioned in the matan, the core concepts. Number 2, what's mentioned in the sharh. And then there's some extra things that I've added, whether I pointed out from Tahtawi, etc. If you come up with questions, and then collectively collectively come up with the questions, and then self-answer them. But the question, this would be really useful when we offer it as a course online as well. We come up with questions, right? You guys agree to that assignment? And you can break it up amongst yourselves. Simple. Come up with, for each chapter, questions related to the matan, questions on the key details in the sharh, and things that were added, right? We come up with that, and then we can do, you want to see sample questions, Shaykh Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid's footnote, edition of Nur al-Idah, which we can share in case someone doesn't have it. What's it called? Sabilul Falah. At the end of each section, he has questions, but those are taken from just the matan. And that's sort of the core. And you can take, some of the questions are really obvious, right? A question is something that has some meaning of testing. And so don't ask yourself, like, what are the arkan of wudu? That's not a question to ask a person with a semblance of sanity.